This is Obsessed with Assessment podcast, the show on which we interrogate assessment from a non-expert point of view in the hopes that we might be able to crack it open for listeners everywhere. The voice that you're hearing now is that of the non-expert Sam Deno. I have been working in the education industry for 14 years, both in the secondary classroom and within EdTech. And the voice you'll hear next is that of my non-expert co-host, Emma Louise Rose McHale.
That was a very, very enthusiastic opening. You sound excited about about today's topic.
How do you hold together an assessment podcast without an expert to be seen anywhere? Well, that's what the audience might be asking. Well, we do a lot of reading and a lot of research, and that's all coming up.
Today we are talking about optimising learners' brains for revision. I was going to say children, but I feel like it's relevant for a lot of different ages. What is the best way to revise?
Do you know, I've got to be honest, I've always been a little bit stumped when it comes to revision.
We usually say this at the beginning. You're approaching this as a former secondary teacher and me as a former primary teacher, but this feels like a question that would come up a lot in secondary.
Yeah, so if a parent asks, how should my child revise? Then when I was full-time in a classroom, I did have no answer to that question. How should my child revise? Apart from saying, well, they should revise this topic and this topic and this topic, or pointing them to like a YouTube video or something engaging.
Yeah, there's a lot of those support resources around, isn't there, online?
And then when it comes to leading revision sessions at school, like intervention sessions, kind of pre-exam revision sessions, I've just simply gone over the same ground again and said and taught the same thing, just in a more condensed way, hoping that reminding students of what we discussed earlier in the year will stick. I wish I'd had time to stop and do some reading, because that's not something that teachers have an awful lot of time to do, is it?
Absolutely not.
It turns out that there is, if not a revision silver bullet, there's definitely some well-evidenced science behind how to get optimal results out of revision, or indeed out of the retention of learning. And do you know what? It all comes down to the brain. Now, this is where we go into my slightly hacky psychological understanding.
Yeah, please don't write in with complaints. if you happen to be a psychologist listening to this, just, shut down for a little bit.
Yeah. Two types of memory, okay? And it depends which text you read, but they're called different things. But I'm going to call them temporary memory and permanent memory. So we constantly receive information, and a lot of that information is stored in our temporary memory so that it's useful in the moment, but then after a short period of time we can no longer recall it because we don't need it for that long.
I feel like I have a lot of those types of memories.
So obviously for a teacher, the trick with revising, or the trick with trying to get their students to retain information, is to enable them to store that information in their permanent memories so that it remains there, and so that it's easier for them to retrieve upon requirement. But this takes much more effort, but obviously it has better results as well.
It's interesting that, because there's things that do stick in your head from school even now. So I would say they've definitely landed in my permanent memory somehow, but I wonder I wonder why those ones have.
Can you give us an example?
Simultaneous equations.
Really?
We'll never use them. If you put them in front of me, I'll be like, yeah, I'm pretty confident I can do that.
Yeah, that is interesting. Maybe as we go through this, we'll get to the bottom of why you can remember simultaneous equations. So that is the question, though, isn't it? How do we embed information into our permanent memory? Here, again, a hacky response to that is about engaging with a subject rather than merely looking at it, and about building connections in the brain between one thing and another thing. So in the in the secondary pupil instance, when you sort of pre-exams, like last minute revision cramming is not the solution to remembering, storing things in your permanent memory. If a student does an hour of isolated reading the night before an exam, then that information just does not embed.
Okay, is it about sort of the chance to apply it, I guess, as well, rather than just going back to it over and over again? I assume that's quite a big element.
Yep, exactly. Application of which we'll come to in a minute in terms of how you retrieval practice, sort of testing things. They've probably got a better chance, the student, if they cram for an hour in the morning just before the exam, but that's still only an hour's worth of content that they'll be hoping to hold in their temporary memory. Whereas when you're in an exam, you need more than an hour's worth of content to do well for yourself. So my reading took me to a chap called Jonathan Firth, who is a psychologist, educator and author. And he lists several revision no-nos that students should avoid, including cramming, alongside various other things that sounded very familiar to me because they're all things I did or told students to do. Mindless copying. He said, mindless copying, i.e. get a textbook, copy it out on your own bit of paper. That does not help information to embed in your memory, which surprised me because that is my go-to revision technique.
Do you think, well, yes, some people must think it works for them. I mean, I'm sure it does work for some people.
I suppose it depends. When you spoke about engagement, I suppose it depends how much you're engaging, doesn't it, when you are writing it down.
And I suppose mindless copying is very different from writing something down in your own words as well, because you could read a book and then go, okay, I'm going to summarise that on paper in my own words, and that is the application of it, isn't it, to a small degree.
Yes, and yes, I suppose you'd call that synthesization, wouldn't you? Which, yes, I think that is an effective means of engaging. Overlearning. Jonathan Firth advises against overlearning, which is when your student has got a concept like simultaneous equations, you don't need to keep on revising it, or you don't need to keep on going over that ground again and again and again because you've got it already. Rereading. Again, this is something I'm guilty of. If I was revising for something, I would go back to the textbook and I would just read it again.
Yeah, that's classic, isn't it? I think especially for, like you say, secondary students who are maybe start doing it themselves at home, like, I'll get your textbook out and read it again.
But if you're not engaging with that, if you're just reading it, then there's no point. And I suppose similarly, the other thing that I've mentioned earlier, like watching YouTube videos, if you're not engaging with that YouTube video, it's just less effective. Highlighting does not work as a revision technique.
Oh, that's interesting. From a primary point of view, what's interesting about these is some of them I think happen by accident, and I don't think it's because teachers are, well, I know we were saying this before we started recording, weren't we? Secondary pupils are often revising themselves, although they will have direction from school, clearly. But for those like end of year 6 primary, end of the primary phase stuff, a lot of that is in school. There's not much chance that there's going to be like any solid chunks of revision happening at home. I mean, it probably depends on the school and the parent, but it's certainly very, very teacher-led. And it'd be interesting to see how many of those no-nos are being used even in schools, who in theory should know better, but we also know that from being in schools that sometimes it's just it's tried and tested, we've done it before, and maybe you don't have time to do that research like you were saying as well. So yeah, it'd be interesting to know if there's any primary teachers out there going, oh no, I do that with my year 6s.
I think you're absolutely right. I think it does come down to teaching technique and strategy as much as anything, doesn't it? Because it's not the pupil who has the pedagogical knowledge, it's the teacher, and they need to know how to tell their children to learn. Going back to Firth, his point is that for things to become embedded in a student's permanent memory, then the student has to engage with it and actively process it. Simply receiving that information again in a passive way does not enable them to remember it more.
Now we need to know what is going to help us remember it more.
Well, let's ask Dr. John I really struggle with this chap's name. Dr. John Dunlovsky, American author. And he's got these great techniques. He points to two valuable techniques that studies actually over the course of decades. He sort of points to years and years of evidence for this. These techniques have been found to be among the most effective for memory retention and therefore in secondary for revision. And these two techniques are called distributed practice and retrieval practice. And if you combine those two techniques, then they're particularly potent, as modelled in all of his test cases. So to kick that off, then I'll talk about distributed practice. If you imagine that, I'm going science here. So I'm going secondary science. Imagine that a student has an infection and response test on Friday, and they say, right, I'm going to put aside 2 hours this week to do my revision. So what they might do, and in fact what they probably will do in most cases, is they'll sit down on Thursday night, 7 o'clock, and they'll go through their notes until 9. And there you go. They've done their 2 hours, they've done their due diligence, and they can sit the test in the morning thinking, I've made a good effort and I've done my revision. However, evidence very clearly demonstrates that if they were to split their revision into smaller blocks of time and distribute it over the week, then they'd likely get much better test scores. So instead of 2 hours on Thursday, if they went through their notes for 30 minutes, let's say, at a time on Monday, then on Tuesday, then on Wednesday, then on Thursday, they'd spend the same amount of time. They've not lost any more time out of the rest of their lives, but they would increase their outcomes, and that's what evidence shows us.
Probably less laborious. It's little and often as a rule for a lot of things is a lot easier, isn't it?
Yeah, so hopefully more palatable. Yeah.
Yeah.
So somehow through that period of processing and revisiting, that information gets locked down more effectively in their long-term memory. Now, I don't have the scientific explanation for that, but that is sort of evidence-based psychology.
I think anecdotally, I could see that would work for me. Yeah, like I would rather spend 20 minutes doing something a few times a week than sit and do something in one big block.
However, we spoke about engagement. They may still not be engaging very well with that material because they could just read for 30 minutes on one night, 30 minutes the next night, read for 30 minutes the next night, and so on. Now, retrieval practice means testing, and you can test yourself in all sorts of ways. So it could be like synthesization, it could be multiple choice quiz, it could be somebody get your parent to fire a bunch of questions at you, whatever. It doesn't matter, in fact. But let's say in this case that a student is using a revision worksheet. So they've got their science revision worksheet. Now, repeatedly, evidence demonstrates that pupils who test themselves on their revision material before an exam fare much better than those who absorb information passively, as we've said. So if we return to the model of distributed practice and combine the two concepts, then we'll get the most optimal effect. So imagine on Monday, the student looks over their notes for 30 minutes, and then on Tuesday, they answer the questions on their revision worksheet. And then on Wednesday, they go over their notes again. And then on Thursday, they go back to their worksheet and answer the questions, maybe the same questions, maybe a new set of questions. It probably doesn't matter that much. They've both done distributed practice because they've spread it out, and they've also done retrieval practice. They've tested themselves.
I also think this really allows for time for children to study more than one subject as well, because as we know, like if you're doing a block of GCSEs, you're not doing one. I think that's quite a nice. You could really timetable stuff in, couldn't you, and make it less daunting.
And in fact, there's possibly a wider strategy within that. So if you are teaching as a school, if you are planning your timetable for your GCSEs, then you could be encouraging students, or as a form tutor, you could be encouraging students to absolutely map out their timetable to a really sort of drilled down level, where you say, right, maths Monday, Wednesday, Friday revision, Tuesday, Thursday do your English, and then really spread it out. So there you go. That's fail safe. Absolutely guaranteed you will.
You're definitely going to pass. Take our advice. And I think that's really interesting, and interesting that both students can apply it and classrooms, teachers can apply it.
Yeah, and I think that would be the main takeaway, really, would be that classroom teachers can apply it. So it's not just about students training themselves to revise more strategically, but it's about teachers teaching more strategically, thinking about the brain, thinking about how young people, and in fact how all people, absorb information, and thinking, okay, so it could be like in a primary school, it could be spacing out a topic. So you say, right, we're going to teach Romans here at this point in the term, but then, kids, we're going to come back to it again in 6 weeks' time, and we're going to look at it again. Does that sound like a model that's possible?
Well, it's funny that you use the history thing, because I am a big lover of history, and it's what I used to lead in school. And one of the things I would always recommend would be a timeline in your classroom that runs. You know, you have it from year 1 and to year 6, and every time you come up against a new history unit, you almost compare it to the ones you've done before. So although you're not explicitly teaching it again, it's there constantly being. You're getting a reminder of it all the time. So like, actually, we looked at the Romans, let's have a little comparison to now what we're learning about the Vikings, and see what their differences are, and using that as a teaching method probably does help to embed the original learning of the Romans, which would be nice.
Yes, and in fact there was something I touched on earlier about joining things up, joining ideas together, and that fits in with that really nicely. That when things are linked to other things in the brain, then that's one way of embedding them in the permanent memory. And I suppose the other sort of takeaway there is then, so train students in how their brains work. So it's all very well teachers having the knowledge of how students' brains work, but if students understand their own brains, and that enables them to learn things themselves and to space things out themselves in an effective way for their own development, then that's very useful for everybody as well. I think that's everything we were going to say.
I liked this one. It felt like a nice chat, and I feel like I've learned something about, that I can apply, which is nice.
I can't wait to hear your test results. Well, thanks everybody for listening, and please do get in touch. Please do leave comments if you can find a comment box somewhere on the page, whichever platform you're listening to this on. You can get in touch with us also at assessment@twinkle.co.uk, and we'll be back. Thanks, Emma. See you soon.